Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Rent Prep AMA session for March 2023. I'm so glad to have you guys here with us today. We got an excellent show for you. We have actually a special guest, Devin Redmond from Stessa and Roofstock. We're going to be adding him in here in just a minute. But before we jump into today, I wanted to just take a quick second and mention to everyone that when we do the podcasts, when we do the AMAs, when we do any of our video content, it's important that you take the information that you gather from these situations, from these calls, and run it by your local team that understands your unique situation in wherever you happen to be in your market, in your investment strategy, things of that nature. You're always going to want to run anything that you hear on a podcast by your licensed professional, your attorney, your accountant, your tax pros, just to make sure that you're getting the best possible advice for your unique scenario. Keep in mind that the information that we do talk about here is more general than anything else, and it's a good idea to always make sure that you're reinforcing that information with information that you're getting directly from the sources that have the best knowledge of what your unique situation is. Just wanted to make sure that we had mentioned that. Welcome to the March AMA. I'm glad to have everybody here. As I'd mentioned, we have Devin Redmond on with us today. I'm going to go ahead and add him in here. Maybe if we're lucky. There we go.
Hello.
Devin, how are you today?
I'm doing good.
Good. Thank you for joining us today.
Finally not raining where I am, so things are drying out.
Listen, it's still snowing here, so I guess we can't really complain too much. I would settle for rain at this point. It's been a pretty brutal winter here in Western New York. Devin, do me a favor. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you ended up working with Roofstock and Stessa, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have worked a number of jobs in real estate. So I started as a tenant rep broker with Jones Lang LaSalle on the commercial side in LA. When I was, early 20s, went to business school in real estate and finance at Cal, and then worked for Heinz Interests on the commercial side for about 6 or 7 years. So during my time there, I did a lot of underwriting, asset management, mostly for office buildings, some R&D stuff, and then got into SFR when I moved over to the tech/software side. When I was employee number 3 or 4 at Stessa back in 2018. Wow. Yeah, so I started as director of customer success there. And basically, it was very, very early days, and we didn't really know what we were building yet. We knew we wanted to build something around bookkeeping, particularly for small and mid-size SFR kind of mom and pop investors. And so my job for the first couple of years there was to go out and talk to investors, understand what their pain points are, where the problems are, how they're doing their bookkeeping, how they're making investing decisions and tracking metrics. And then, Stessa came out of those conversations. And then a couple of years ago now, Roofstock acquired Stessa. And so I've had a couple different roles since then inside of Roofstock.
Nice. Very interesting. Tell us a little bit more about Stessa and what is this that they do? Because I bet you there's a pretty substantial portion of our audience that has never heard of them before.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stessa is we like to think of it as an asset management layer. So it's not a property management tool per se, although we have gotten into some property management functions, but it's basically cloud-based software. We have a pro subscription tier now that has some advanced tools, and then there's also a free tier. So it's pretty easy to kind of sign up and check it out. And one of the things we've tried to do from the beginning is build financial connectivity into the core aspect of the product. And a lot of the benefits to investors come from that. So you can connect your bank accounts, you can connect to certain property management data flows, particularly Propertyware and Appfolio. Everything gets kind of sucked in terms of expenses and income. And then it's really easy from there to run key reports like net cash flow reports, balance sheet, schedule real estate owned, all those sorts of things. And so it's, a lot of folks get real engaged with it around tax time. Between January and sort of now for the next month or so is kind of core season. And then, the rest of the year, also kind of on a monthly basis, keeping up with how you're doing. Then you can see your performance. You can make adjustments during the year. We found that a lot of, these are things that bigger landlords and commercial investors do weekly or monthly, right? To understand kind of where they're at. In our early conversations, we often found that mom and pop investors are not as focused on that during the year, right? They're dealing with operational things, time goes by, then all of a sudden tax time rolls around and they realize, hey, I didn't even make any money this year. What happened, right? So Stessa is in large part designed to help solve that problem so that you're always in the know in terms of how things are going.
Kind of help it recognize it early and course correct before you get to the end of the year and realize that everything's gone completely sideways on you, sort of a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Nice.
we've built other things into the product now. There's also you can actually open up checking accounts, so you can have a checking account per property. We do that through a banking partner, so we have banking as a service. So there's a lot there. I encourage folks to kind of check it out.
Nice. Very cool. Well, we have a ton of questions here that have come in through our Facebook group over the course of the last week or so. And it's a whole variety of topics. It's everything from property management, a little bit of tax stuff thrown in there, some tenant management, some tenant selection stuff in there. You ready to jump into it?
Good. Yeah, let's do it. I'll just say a quick disclaimer, like I'm not a CPA. I'm not licensed to give advice, investment advice. I'm not a broker. So, talking from my own experience, I am an investor myself. I've owned rental property in both California and Hawaii. Short term, long term, I've done some fix and flip stuff. But everything I'm saying is just from my experience, and your experience will be different.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier in the intro. Make sure that any advice that you pick up I pick up something in pretty much every podcast episode that I research. I pick up something in pretty much every AMA that I host from either my research or from the person that I'm talking to. And you have to take that information and then run it by your local team that understands your unique situation before you implement something like that. Otherwise, you're just going to wind up in a great big headache. Well, you have the potential of winding up in a great big headache anyway.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Everyone has a very different risk profile, right? So things that I might be comfortable with, other folks have no business doing because of the way they think about money or their relationships. So there's a full spectrum there.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start off with this question from Jack. We traveled out of state to Florida and New Mexico in 2022 to look for rental properties to purchase via a 1031 exchange with our existing rental property in Illinois. The trips were 100% business, and we have plenty of documentation showing the properties we viewed and the realtors we met. While we didn't buy any property as a result of these trips, can the travel expenses such as flights, hotels, rental cars, meals, etc., offset rental revenue on our existing property or are otherwise tax deductible in some manner?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I'm not a CPA, so I'm not giving a definitive answer, but this has come up, and I've spoken with folks about it. My understanding is that if you don't end up buying the property, it's sort of speculative acquisition type work, and that it's not clearly deductible, right? So like if you especially if you're using Schedule E, right? Like everything needs to be tied to an actual property that you own. And so like if you don't complete the acquisition, my understanding is that these are kind of pursuit costs that are not deductible against a specific property.
Interesting. I wonder if that changes if you're running expenses through an LLC versus running them directly on like a personal tax return or something like that. I wonder if there would be a change in whether something would be considered deductible or not, because at that point you're talking about operating expenses essentially. So I don't know. That would definitely be something that I think a CPA would be better able to answer than either one of us. I can say that my accountant, and again, this is just my personal experience, other people's experience may vary. I've taken trips to Florida to look at properties before. I've taken trips to meet investors. I've taken trips to conferences. My conferences have always been fully deductible. I've never had any issues with that. My accountant's never red flagged any of that stuff. He was a little bit leery of letting me write off a trip to Florida where I was looking at property but didn't wind up buying anything. But ultimately, he decided that we would probably be okay doing that because, again, I was going down with my company and we were looking at it kind of as an operating expense at that point versus just as a speculative expense. So good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know if that was necessarily the right advice, but that's the advice that I went with. So you've got two different perspectives there, even on question number one, as to whether or not something would or would not be deductible.
Yeah, I do think that education expenses are treated differently than pursuit costs. So those are probably like two different buckets. And I know if you end up buying the property, then there's a clearer path to deducting it.
I might have actually taken a class while I was down there. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that was the reason that he ultimately let me go forward with it. But I usually, whenever I try to travel for work purposes, like going to a conference or something like that, I always try to look at a couple properties while I'm down there for no other reason than to see what the local market looks like. Even if I'm not looking to move to Orlando, for instance, it's nice to know what real estate looks like in other markets and really get a firsthand experience. So it's kind of nice that way.
Right, right. And I imagine it may be different if your LLC is a single member LLC, right, and is treated as a pass through versus a partnership. But I don't really know. I
Yeah.
do know
I
that
guess
like
the
when you own a
answer,
property, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, I do know when you do own a property, and there's a path to deductibility, then there's very specific rules about like separating out your time based on how you spent your time there, personal versus
Hmm.
business. You're supposed to prorate it. It can get a little complicated.
Yeah, travel's one of those things, and the rules for travel change, by the way, in the IRS tax guidelines every single year. So this is a question that you could ask us this year, and you could ask us next year, and get two very, very different answers because there is some stuff that shifts from year to year when it comes to travel allowances and things of that nature. So I guess the answer to Jack's question is talk to your CPA and see what he has to say, he or she has to say, because I think that's the best route to go there. On to our next question from Samantha. How do investors work with properties with no cash flow? Do they put money in every month looking for appreciation down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope you're not putting in money every month,
Hmm.
right? It depends on what the CapEx situation is. I had a investment in Hawaii on Maui that I did with a partner. We closed a month before COVID hit. So this is 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, and we put money in not every month, but almost, and it added up to a lot by the end. This was a fixer. We had a tenant in part of the property for a bit, which helped,
Hmm.
offset the costs. So I think it totally depends on what the risk profile of the investment is and what you're trying to do. But it's definitely true in, coastal markets, places where, prices are high relative to the expected rent.
Hmm.
Yeah, you're not going to see a lot of cash flow. And that was sometimes true even when interest rates were, threes and fours.
Sure.
It's absolutely true today that there's not much cash flow.
Hmm.
And so when you're making bets on appreciation, yeah, that's kind of how it goes. So you need to be in a financial position yourself to weather that.
Well, and talking about Hawaii as a market specifically, Hawaii has a tendency to be very generational when it comes to real estate because the real estate costs are so expensive. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I've never invested there. But my understanding from some
Yeah.
friends that live out there is that essentially a lot of real estate winds up getting passed from one generation to the next simply because of how expensive real estate has become out there. There's only so much land, they can't make more of it, and everybody wants it. So it makes it very, very high value. Is there actually cash flow
That's what
left
I've
at the end
seen.
of the day on rentals out there, or is it a situation where you almost have to bank on an appreciation play?
It depends. So for short-term rentals, there's certainly cash flow available.
Hmm.
At least there was, on the prices folks were paying prior to 12 months ago, probably. There's
Hmm.
definitely cash flow there. There's been good growth. The pandemic was a weird situation where, some things got shut down, but
Hmm.
daily rates have come back pretty nicely since then. Occupancy is, 90s plus
Great.
from what we've seen in certain places on Maui. I know that's also true on Kauai. A little less so on the Big Island, a little tougher.
Hmm.
But on long-term rentals, it really depends how you buy it and what you pay.
Hmm.
So if a lot of the product there is either resort style, where second homeowners, retirees are willing to pay up and sort of price investors out. So
Right.
that's really tough to get into. Some of the more local areas, yeah, there's opportunities there, but as you mentioned, like families tend to hold on to the real estate over decades and centuries even.
Yeah.
So it's really a supply issue. You have to keep your eye, you
Yeah.
have to be very patient, and when something comes up, kind of jump on it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And
It
yeah,
seems
you're
like one of
going in
those
cap rate is
situations.
you're
Go
you're,
ahead.
you're going in cap rate is like three maybe
Hmm.
3.5, 4, and it takes a little while. You got to count on rents moving up a bit over time.
Yeah. It sounds tough. Honestly, it sounds like the so I'm in Buffalo. We have cash flow. This is a cash flow market. We don't
Hmm.
necessarily bank on appreciation plays here. And I typically tell my clients not to bank on an appreciation play. simply because honestly, the property values in Buffalo up until the last few years have been relatively flat, a couple percent a year increase in value. And that's about all you're going to get up until these last few years when the market's been absolutely insane. And we've seen, sometimes double digit growth in property values here. So I always tell my clients not to bank on an appreciation play in this market, but in that market, it sounds like you almost have to bank on an appreciation play just to even think about getting into the game.
Yeah, I think that's right. You never know what's going to happen with appreciation. Some of these wild increases the last few years, right, probably
Mm-hmm.
take some of the wind out of the sails for the next few years. That's kind of my
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it. Like there's been a big run up. It's hard, it's hard to see that continuing
Sure.
indefinitely. Um, so, I think for some of the stuff I've done in Hawaii, like I've had other motivations too. It's a place I like to go. So when I have to
Right.
go deal with something, whether it's do work or meet with a tenant or whatever it is, like I get on a plane and go to Hawaii. Like I enjoy that. So that was
Right.
part of my strategy and just personally for me investing. And then it has, long term, maybe I convert it back to personal and retire there, right? So it has some
Mm-hmm.
other optionality that was important to me. But I think that's where it gets back to like there's this full spectrum of risk profile and
Mm-hmm.
investor interests that is very personal and unique to each individual. So other places I've looked at investing. So like I track the Tucson market, I track the Cincinnati market, and that's because I
Mm-hmm.
have family connections there. And so if I had to go deal with something there, I have another reason to go and another sort of side benefit. So it's just
Sure.
one potential strategy or way to think about where and how you invest.
Now, your holdings in Hawaii, is that short term or long term rental?
At the most, so we sold the fixer project that I was working on for a couple of years. We sold that in September, and so right now I've got 3 units long term,
Mm-hmm.
and on one property, and then I've got a short term down by the coast.
Gotcha. Okay. And the short term is performing well now that we're kind of through all the COVID restrictions and everything?
Yeah, it's been doing great. We just closed on that a year ago, so
Mm-hmm.
we had a pretty good path to revenue right away. We didn't get impacted by any lockdowns or shutdowns,
Mm-hmm.
and we've seen good rate growth from, we were kind of like in the mid 200s a night, and now we're kind of closer to mid 300s on
Mm-hmm.
average. So
Okay.
part of that's been kind of how we repositioned in our booking strategy, and part of
Mm-hmm.
that's just been growth and rebound in the travel industry overall.
Gotcha. Okay. Very cool. It's nice to see like short and long term experience. It's kind of nice to hedge bets both directions in that way.
Yeah. I mean, they're very different operationally. So the short term has been kind of a steep learning curve for me to figure out how to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm self managing that from the West
Mm-hmm.
Coast. So I have a superstar cleaning person, and that's been a really big factor in making it work. And then I've also found some great. I love the software called Owner Res,
Mm-hmm.
which has been fantastic for me in terms of consolidating all my booking calendars and rates, and then it pushes that out to the booking channels. So
Yeah,
my
to the
challenge
various
this year is
platforms you're
is
on.
moving. Yeah, my challenge this year is moving off of the booking channels as much as possible to direct
Mm-hmm.
bookings.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a bigger, I mean, with any sort of a booking service, there's always a delta. You lose some form of money because the booking service is taking something off the top. That's how they make their money. That's how they stay in operation. So anything that you're able to book directly, I mean, really, you're talking about a 3% card processing fee, and that's about it. Like you're going to save a bundle if you're able to do it in that fashion and bring people in for direct reservation. I think there's a big savings there.
Yeah. Between Airbnb and VRBO, I think their average fee take is somewhere between 15 to 18,
Hmm.
depending on duration of the stay and the total booking revenue.
Right.
So plus the 3% card process, you take the three out of there, it's 15% delta. And
Hmm.
so if you can give half of that back to the guest, right, and
Hmm.
then keep the rest, kind of split the difference. Is kind of how I think about it. And then
Yeah.
over time, you're also not as exposed to, things that like Airbnb decided to do during the pandemic, right?
Right. Right.
We're going to send all this money back to your guests. Well, where does that leave you?
Right, exactly. Yeah, there were a lot of people during that, especially the arbiters that were, doing short-term Airbnb arbitrage. There were a lot of them that unfortunately took a real beating when that came down. Just the way it goes. Like when you're running a business on somebody else's platform, it's no different than when I list a vacant apartment for rent on Facebook Marketplace. It's their platform. They get to decide whether the ad stays or goes. They can shadow ban it, they can hide it from people, whatever they want to do. When you're dealing with somebody else's platform, you're always at their mercy, essentially. Which, yeah, I think to move directly to booking yourself is a smart move. It's a big delta there. Moving on to our next question from Randy. After 10 homes, we will have to get creative with financing, right? I understand that you can only get 10 properties with conventional financing.
Yeah, so this is true. I have not pushed beyond the 10 home limit, but I have had conversations with folks about this specifically. There's a couple strategies. So one is you can always go commercial, right?
Right.
You can go beyond that and go commercial. You end up paying a little higher rate, different requirements, might be harder to qualify. You can go with a DSCR portfolio loan, something that more local banks not going to sell into the secondary market, so they can get more creative there. And then the other option is the sort of like, I guess you describe it as sort of dollar cost averaging up, right? You can start to sell off lower priced properties and then frees up some capacity to do conventional loans into more expensive things. You could, use 1031 exchanges to help you do that.
Yeah,
So
that
that,
makes sense.
so that the value of your portfolio is still increasing, not necessarily the number of doors. And I kind of
That's
like that strategy
actually,
because as your number of doors goes up, so does the time you have to put into things.
well, and I was like, when you said that, I'm like, that doesn't make a bit of sense. And then as you explained it, I'm like, that makes perfect sense. It's the same workload. Oftentimes, as you move up market, your headaches go down because the tenant classes change. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I can tell you that on our end, what we typically recommend for our clients is we do have a couple of banks here that will do portfolio loans or blanket loans across like an entire portfolio of properties. And there's one bank in particular in our region that's very smart about how they do it. They set it up in such a way that on the front end what your payoff is going to be. And they can run new payoff numbers, but what your payoff number is going to be on each property inside that loan. So if you decide to peel off a duplex and go buy a 4-unit, you still have that ability without having to kill the entire loan. You just pay off that portion of the loan, and then they'll probably turn around and put your new property right into that loan package, that portfolio loan. So that seems to work really, really well. Like you mentioned, it is commercial financing, so you do pay a little bit more on the financing end of it, but it frees up your personal credit so that you can go out and buy more or do whatever it is that you need to do on your end to be able to free up your financing a little bit more. I think it's a smart strategy no matter how you do it.
Yeah, I like that. I think one challenge right now with this sort of strategy of cycling out of conventional loans is, when rates have really popped, right? So you may be maxed out with 10 great loans that you don't necessarily want to walk away from. So to me, that opens up the avenue of going commercial and sticking with the investments you've made so far. If you've got a great loan in place until rates go back down, and you get some more flexibility.
Goes back to the saying, marry the property, date the rate. Essentially, you're going to wait until the rates come back down and refinance it. Do what you need to do. Don't let a good opportunity pass you by now, as long as the numbers work. In my market, I'm telling people, you make sure that you've got some cash flow coming out of it, even if the interest rate's higher than what you want, because it's going to be so much more attractive 2, 3, 5 years down the road when the interest rates come back down and you can refinance that into a little bit more stable mortgage, if you will.
Yeah. But I think one thing to watch out for is, like, as rates come down, we'll see how it goes here. But if rates stay high for a while, right, it can create buying opportunities if you have the dry powder. So it's always it's impossible to time the market, but something to keep an eye out for. The markets I'm watching, things have not come off much from their June highs, maybe 4 to 5%. It doesn't seem like enough of a discount.
That's kind of what we're seeing here in Buffalo as well. The market is still really, really strong. We are still seeing properties move, not as quick as they were, but we're still seeing a lot of multiple offer situations for maybe you've got 2 or 3 offers instead of 10 or 20 offers. Maybe you're going at or maybe a little bit above ask versus way over ask. We're still seeing transactions moving along, but it's slower than it was, but I haven't seen the pricing come down the way that I would have expected it to with the interest rates going up. I kind of would have expected there to be more of an inverse there, but not so much, at least in this market. People seem to still be out there.
Yeah.
They're willing to buy. The sellers aren't willing to sell for what they would have sold for in 2020. They still want their 21 and 22 pricing, even with these higher interest rates. So again, I think a lot of people are going to be in a situation where they're going to have to buy the property and date the rate. And when the rates come back down, you can basically refinance it and move on, or, refinance it and continue to cash flow.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm seeing a lot of sellers who would like to sell at a certain price, but they don't need to sell. They don't have to. There's not the
Right.
motivation or desperation there that we've seen in other down cycles.
Well, and depending on the seller, they have to have something to move into. So even if they sell you their house for $120,000 more than what it's rightfully worth, they still need to go buy something else, and they're going to be paying $120,000 more than what that property is worth. So it's
Right.
it's going to be a little bit of an ongoing thing, at least in our market, and I think in most markets it's going to be an ongoing thing for probably the next. Everything I'm seeing is saying that we're probably not going to see interest rates drop for a couple years. I don't know. Maybe you have more insight than I would on that.
No, I mean, it changes week by week, right? Depending on what's happening in the banking system and, what somebody's saying on what somebody's saying on CNBC. So
Yeah, right.
it's just hard to know. Who knows? Maybe we get a pause here and things kind of stay flat for a while.
No, I hope so. Well, I guess we'll see what happens. I don't want to see anything come to a pause, but we had a long enough pause during COVID. Like, we couldn't move, we couldn't sell houses, we couldn't show apartments. I don't need another pause. All right, we'll move on to our next question from Anel here. Hi guys, what app do you use to keep track of all your yearly expenses and write-offs? So we're at the corporate level, so we're using QuickBooks on the corporate side, and then for our managed stuff, we're using Appfolio. What are you using? You said you're self-managing. What do you use to keep track of your expenses?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I use Stessa. I've got an inside track there, and so understand how it works. And the customer service team tends to get back to me pretty quick if I have an issue, so that works for me. I know, a lot of the folks I remember talking to in the beginning, they would use like a Google sheet or a spreadsheet, right, to keep track of things. And it was super messy, especially if you invest with others and have partners. So, when I did my fixer, I did that with a partner. I set that property up in Stessa, got the bank account connected that we opened for it. And then I invited my partner into Stessa through the collaborator tool. And so he could see everything that was going on. Anytime something hit the P&L or we made a new CapEx investment, it was in there. So that was kind of nice. It kind of cut down on the email back and forth that we did. And then, I know, and Stessa is not for everyone either, right? Like sometimes QuickBooks is, if you get into some really complicated stuff and you've got the time and the money to allocate to customizing QuickBooks and you want to do all double entry, you want to do journal entries, balance sheet is like super important that it always checks out and get it exactly right. Like, QuickBooks is designed to be super powerful and flexible for that sort of thing. Stessa takes a very different sort of opinionated track about this is for real estate investors who kind of keep it in the fairway to some extent and don't want to allocate the time and the money to learn a whole accounting program or pay a CPA to do it. So it's the sort of like DIY option. And that's kind of that's what I need right now.
Yeah, I know that there are a lot of investors that start off their investing journey using nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet or whatever the case may be. And I guess the one thing I would say is the sooner that you can find a solution that works for you and move to that solution and get away from a spreadsheet that's not really giving you the data in a format that's usable the way that you would want it, the better off you're going to be. There's only so much that you can get out of a spreadsheet without having some more advanced programming built into it or something like that. Even breaking things out into categories and things of that nature can get complicated when you're working from a spreadsheet. But ... the most important thing is whatever system you use it and you keep it up to date. Like kind of what you were saying with Stessa early on. You don't want to come in and I'm going to put my data in now because it's tax time. And then I'm going to ignore this until next year when it's tax time again, because number one, you're going to have a ton of work to do. And number two, you run the risk of hitting the guardrails or going off the guardrails if you haven't been paying attention, and you may be in a situation where you're not even cash flowing and don't realize it because you're not paying attention to your books. So the best solution is the solution you're going to use before you get into anything else. And then I would say, pick the thing that makes the most sense for you, whether it be Buildium, Appfolio, Stessa, whatever. QuickBooks, not the easiest to use QuickBooks, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and make sure your key partners, if you have a bookkeeper, if you have a CPA, that they're kind of on board and cool with whatever's going to be produced from those platforms. I do think in the beginning too, if you just have one or two properties, like you don't want to overcomplicate it, right? And so setting up QuickBooks, doing the chart of accounts, creating all your own categories, that's a lot of work, and I think, can kind of sour you on the whole idea of what is supposed to be sometimes sort of passive investing.
No, absolutely. Well, and for most small multis, single families and small multis, I think it's people overcomplicate things a little bit more than they need to. Like if you look at a monthly statement for one of our clients for any given month and they own a single family, you're going to see income in this column and you're going to see expenses in this column. And there's a total at the bottom. It doesn't need to be much more complicated than that. But when you want to take that data and look at it from a year or a 2-year view or something along those lines, that's where your spreadsheets start to fall apart. And it's time for a little bit more robust software, which is, any of the softwares out there are going to have excellent reporting capabilities. And I think that's what most people need when it comes time for taxes is, hey, accountant, here's my information. What else do you need to tell me how much I owe to the IRS? So, all right, we'll go into our next question here. This one is from Denise. Can someone who filed bankruptcy 3 years ago still invest in real estate?
I have no idea. Yes, I would imagine there is a path. Is it the sort of like conventional, cheapest path to getting conventional financing at a decent rate? I don't know, right? It's not just about the property; it is also about the borrower. So, the banks that you would typically go to get the best rates are going to be digging in on credit scores and your full kind of financial history. That's part of the deal, right? That you're backstopping these loans. It's not just rent from the property.
What about a situation where somebody finds the right deal and they have access to private money, hard money, something of that nature? Would you say, maybe we should look at doing this with hard money, or would you try to avoid that in most of your deals?
Yeah, I think it depends on kind of who you are, what you're good at, what the deal is, right? So I think, I haven't worked with hard money lenders much. They're going to dig in as well, right? And kind of understand who you are as a borrower, what's your likelihood to pay this back if things go sour at the property. But if you're, I would say like at that point, it's all about your network, right? If a normal bank route isn't gonna pay off for you, then it's your network. Who do you know? Who can you partner with? Who do you have a good trusting relationship with? And then maybe you package that up and say, this is my team, and you go to a hard money lender or another financing source to really kind of put it together that it's this is something you're aware of, and you're sort of like structuring or building around it to make the opportunity more compelling for whoever you're trying to get funding from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you can actually present it as, look, it's not just me in the situation. It's me. Here's my contractor that's going to be doing the rehab work. Here's the property management company that we've selected. They're the ones who are going to be handling the day-to-day operations of it. I think the more people with experience on a deal, it's going to make any lender feel a little bit more comfortable when they see that there's an actual organized team of professionals surrounding this person, even if that person might be a little bit, from a financial standpoint, questionable, either credit damage or something like that. Having a good team can sometimes help you get the deal through a bank that otherwise might not, especially with local banks. If you have a local bank, we found in our market that knows the local property management company or knows the contractor and kind of says, all right, well, we know that, these pieces of the puzzle fit together and everything is legitimate. Maybe this is a risk that's worth taking in the long run to get this new client or whatever the case may be. So there are a couple banks here in Western New York that'll do stuff like that, but it is getting harder and harder to find. and you basically have to find either a hard money lender or someone who may not necessarily be pulling your credit checks and stuff like that to see all of that, I think, to get some of those deals over the finish line.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually had a tenant with a bankruptcy on their application, and it was kind of
Mm-hmm.
the only thing that was a little bit of a red flag. And we just, I asked them questions about it, and they were super straightforward and forthcoming about, what happened. It was back in like, '08, '07,
Mm-hmm.
'08,
Mm-hmm.
when a lot of folks just got into tough situations through no fault of their own, right? We had a great
Mm-hmm.
conversation about it, and they backed up, what was going on and what was happening for them recently, and they turned out to be a great tenant for a couple of years till they moved out.
No, that's awesome. And sometimes you really do have to, there's more to tenant screening than just a credit score. Like, we look at the credit score, obviously, but we also look at the overall payment history. And okay, is it student loans? Is it medical debt? Is it you're not paying your cable bill? Like, those things all kind of get looked at a little bit differently depending on what the scenario is. And if it's a situation kind of like what you were saying, where you had somebody that had filed a bankruptcy, but since the bankruptcy, they've started rebuilding or whatever the case may be, a lot of times you can see that and kind of see, okay, here's where the cart went off the rails. They got back on. Now we're moving forward, sort of a situation. So sometimes it makes sense to take those little risks, I call them, when you can see that somebody's really working to improve themselves.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's worth reading the actual report and digging in on and to understand, like, okay, who is this person or these people? What's their full story, not
Mm-hmm.
just their stats and kind of what the algorithm kicks out.
Absolutely. So I do want to mention before we jump into the next question, I forgot to mention this at the start. If you guys are watching live and you have any questions, you can drop them into the chat window. We do have Josh from the marketing team with us on the back end, and he's able to copy and paste anything into our chat window so we can see it and possibly add some more questions as we're moving along here. So if you guys do have questions or want something explained a little bit more in depth, feel free to reach out and let us know. We're going to jump right to our next question from Linda. What are your thoughts on Venmo, Zelle, or Cash App? I have a new tenant that wants to pay electronically. How do you go about receiving your rents?
Yeah, so there are a lot of new options. So for me, my tenants in Hawaii, there's a bank branch up around the corner. It's like a block away, and they deposit checks straight into my LLC account there. So
Mhm.
that works for them. It works for me. The money's there almost immediately. There's no fees associated,
Mhm.
and it's super easy.
No, that's
Uh,
very convenient.
yeah, Venmo. I think Venmo and PayPal both have problems in terms of like some of the ways they've, I think, started reporting. All the funds coming in, and then you end up in like 1099 situations potentially.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's a little bit. I also know like some landlords, depending on what the rent amount is, tenants end up having to like break it up into 2 or 3 payments, and then you get like accounting challenges.
Mhm.
And I think it's technically against their terms of service to be using the personal features, which have no fees, for what is essentially a sort of business transaction.
Right.
So yeah, I mean Zelle is kind of quick and easy. There's some
Mhm.
increased fraud potential there if somebody gets the wrong phone number, if your tenant doesn't have all the right contact info, that can be a little tricky. But I know folks who use Zelle, and that works pretty well.
Mhm.
Um, there's also, like, Stessa has a built-in rent collection feature now. There's other online platforms that have it built in.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay in terms of ACH, but ACH to me is tried and true and very safe.
Absolutely. Well, and I did pop up on the screen here while we were chatting. We actually did a video on this on the Rent Prep channel, the Rent Prep YouTube channel, a couple months back, where we broke out PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App. I think were the four apps that we looked at, and we sat and broke it all down. What's the fee structure? Can payments be reversed? What are the withdrawal limits? What are the buyer and seller protections and things of that nature? So you can find that on YouTube by searching Rent Prep payment apps. It'll be the first video that pops up. It's a nice video. We spent some time on that one, just try to make sure that we had all the data right. And that was actually one of the things that I uncovered when we were doing that video was, yes, there's definitely a difference between using it personally and using it for business purposes. It's not terribly complicated to get set up for business purposes. Yes, it might cost you a little bit. You might pay a percent or two in fees or whatnot, but to have the extra protections built in on the business side, I think it's totally worth it if you're going to go the route of using one of those payment apps.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Jumping to our next question. This one is from Shelby. She has a good problem. I have a rental that is cash flowing around $800 a month, but it's killing me in taxes. What is the best way to reinvest these funds into other properties?
Interesting. Yeah, that is a good problem.
I think we all
From a
want that
tax,
problem.
yeah, it's part of why you're investing, right? To get the cash
Hmm.
flow. So, I would say from a tax perspective, like I don't want to speak too much to that. Kind of depends on your whole situation, right? I know some folks try to get to like real estate professional status, right?
Hmm.
If especially if they're married, and then you can offset against more active income on the other side. But
Hmm.
I think you accumulate cash flow, right? And depending on how much depreciation you're taking, maybe you do a cost segregation study, right, to sort
Hmm.
of rack up the depreciation so that these aren't like showing as taxable gains necessarily in every year. And
Hmm.
then you take that cash flow, the pile builds, and then you tee up your kind of next investment.
Where do you stick your money while you're growing your stockpile, while you're growing your nest egg, if you will? Do you leave it just in a normal savings account? Do you have a specific place that you stick it so that it's growing while you're growing? Or how do you handle your funds in between deals?
Yeah, I'm fairly conservative. I keep excess cash in a high yield savings account.
Hmm.
Just this weekend, I was checking balances and making sure that things are insured and in the right place. So you do, I guess you have to pay attention to that too now.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I tend to like prefer to invest in real estate. I have sort of like 401k and retirement stuff in the stock market, and I don't do any sort of higher octane investing in between real estate deals. So I kind of
Hmm.
like to know that cash is there, that I've got some capital to go do something new when the time is right and I find the right opportunity. So for me,
Hmm.
it's just high yield savings account.
Makes
So I'm
sense.
getting
Yeah,
like
it's readily
three and a half,
available.
four
You can
percent.
snap your fingers and put your fingers, on the money right away. You did mention, paying attention to your banks and what your balances and stuff like that are. It's worth mentioning we're recording this on March 13th, 2023. And literally last Friday, Silicon Valley Bank was shut down and taken over by FDIC, which is a pretty big situation for a lot of people. We'll see what the fallout is of that. It's a little bit too early to say, but I think we'll probably at least see a couple of other financial institutions go down along with them. And ultimately, I think they'll probably wind up getting snapped up by another bank. But in the short term, it's created quite a bit of chaos. Way outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but for context, so that people understand why we mentioned that, I think it's relevant to bring that up.
Yeah, huge surprise. But for me, it's also a little bit of a reminder of what I love about real estate investing is, I have the deed to the
Hmm.
property,
Physical,
right?
tangible asset.
Yeah, you have the deed. Everyone needs housing. That's not going to change, right? I have
Hmm.
tenants that have it's in demand. People want to live there. They pay me rent directly. I don't have a lot of middlemen and other partners in the way
Hmm.
who introduce additional risk.
Makes sense. Makes sense. This is probably a little bit more opinion based as a question, but I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on it. This one comes from Paul. Is it better to save cash and buy a home every 2 years flat out cash, or to buy using a loan? I find that using cash, I automatically save about 5 grand in closing costs. Must be referring to like mortgage recording fees and things of that nature, title insurance and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, to me, this is really a question about personal risk profile
Hmm.
and how comfortable are you with leverage.
Hmm.
Biggest difference in my mind between real estate and other types of investing is the leverage that you can get, even as a relatively inexperienced investor, right?
Right.
70, 80% of the
You can
deal
buy a four
cost
unit
can
on an
come.
FHA, 95%.
Yeah, you can go even higher, right? So the cost of entry for the asset size that you're able to be invested in is just very, very low. You can't get that in any other investing uh, asset class, right? So that
Hmm.
creates a ton of opportunity. It also creates a ton of risk because if you got 90% financing and the value goes down by 10%,
Right.
your equity's wiped out.
Hmm.
Now it's worked out in the last 15 years here, right? Equity values have only gone up. And so
Sure.
that magnifies, the leverage really magnifies your upside there.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it better? It depends on how comfortable you are with risk. I don't mind the additional closing costs on
Mm-hmm.
debt financing, especially when the rate's good. And if you're locking in a 30-year fixed at a good rate, chances are that you may not refinance that. I tend to think of my acquisitions as long-term holds. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't always work out that way, but at least I underwrite them as if I'm going to be in it for 10 plus years. And
Mm-hmm.
so in that perspective, with rents hopefully going up, and it makes sense to put debt financing on.
Well, and when you mentioned the equity shift, like that's something that I kind of harped on a little bit during the COVID times when we were talking about people buying properties for 50, 75, $100,000 more than the asking price. And I don't think that was as much of an issue here in Western New York. I mean, we definitely saw stuff going for crazy amounts over ask, but in other markets, you hear people saying I went 150,000 over asking and blah, 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 blah. Okay, if you bought that house for 150 over asking, let's say that it's single family and you bought it on a VA, okay, 0% down. Literally any adjustment to the market puts you underwater. Any negative adjustment to the market puts you underwater. And in my situation, or in my opinion, it's very, very high risk to be low equity, especially in times like now when we're talking about shifting interest rates, shifting values on properties, things of that nature. I really like to see people leverage using loans. But I would say probably 85% leverage is about as high as I would like to see one of my clients be on a property, simply because if something happens and they need to get out of that property, something changes in their personal life, they need to fire sale all their assets or something like that. Hopefully they have at least a little bit of meat on the bone there, so they're not necessarily going underwater or short selling their properties or something along those lines. And the other thing is, I think that leveraging, like, let's say you've got $100,000 to put towards a down payment. Okay, if I'm going to go buy one property with $100,000 and I'm putting 20% down, I'm going to buy one asset, one property. It could be any number of units, but I can also take that $100,000 and split it into 4 $20,000 down payments and have probably a much wider range of assets that I have under ownership. So I like to see people leverage for that reason. Again, like you said, it really does kind of fall back to what is someone's personal risk portfolio or risk profile. There we go. Yeah. What is your personal risk tolerance? Do you like to be more conservative with your numbers, or do you like to play things fast and loose? And, it's generally speaking, when you're playing things fast and loose, I see a lot of people that when the tides go out, you find out they're not wearing a swimsuit. So that's my personal opinion. I'm for loans, but I think that if you're going to loan, I think that there has to be some equity left on the bone there. And I think you kind of agree with that by the sounds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your point about diversification is right on. You don't want all the and it depends. What is that equity relative to your other savings, right? What does that equity represent relative to your W-2 income, or however you're making money, right? Is it tragic if it's all wiped out because of a market correction? And or is that like, well, I've got, portfolio 20 assets. They're different parts of the country. Some are rural, some are urban. If you're very diversified, then you could afford to get wiped out on one. And maybe the tenants are still there paying rent and it cash flows anyways, and you can ride it out.
Actually, it's funny because we have this question from Sean. Thinking about generating cash flow faster, does it make sense to purchase a portfolio of single families versus one unit generating the same income? What's your tolerance for risk? It really boils down, at least on this question, I think it boils down to what's your tolerance for risk. Do you want the first thing I thought when I saw this question was, if I have one single family and I have no tenant in that single family, big goose egg for revenue. If I have a portfolio of 10 single families and I have one vacancy, I have 90% of my revenue still coming through, give or take, coming through the doors. So from where I'm sitting, I would always rather see multiple pieces of real estate that are performing and bringing cash flow through the doors, so that if you do have that one-off vacancy, or if something happens where you need to put a new roof on a property that it blew off as a part of a storm or something like that, but insurance won't cover it, more cash flow coming in to cover the unexpected type of a thing. So I always like to see people, I guess I take the more is better approach to number of doors.
Yeah, I think there's a balance, right? Having just everything in one basket, not a great idea unless you're able to lose it all, right? Um,
Mhm.
if you get spread out too thin though, and you've got a big portfolio and it's all stuff you just acquired, like that can be a lot to ramp up on just, mentally in terms of the time commitment in managing it. So I do think there's kind of a balance there. Maybe it's 3 or 4 or 5 properties, not 10, 15.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. Let's see. Our next question from Bernice. How are you preparing and what have you shifted in your investor strategy, if anything, for the upcoming 12 to 24 months? And then in quotes, she put recession. And again, I think this is probably relevant because we're literally in a situation right now where, Silicon Valley Bank has failed. I think that we're already kind of thinking recession. We've been hearing it in the media for months now, probably close to a year at this point. What's changing in your investment strategy, if anything?
Yeah. For me on the existing things that I own, I'm very focused on cash flow.
Mhm.
And from a long-term rental perspective, that means just making sure that my tenants are doing good, they're comfortable, that I'm on top of maintenance issues, maybe doing a little bit of extra to make
Mhm.
sure that they're happy and going to stick around and renew. On the short-term rental side, we talked about that. I'm trying to move to direct bookings to create a little more
Mhm.
of a buffer. In case nightly rates, start to tick down. If there's a recession, I've got more room there, right, to
Mhm.
still make the same amount of money at the end of the day. In terms of acquisitions, I'm just being very patient and super picky. So I'm watching a few markets, and one of the things I do is I'll go on the MLS like Redfin or something, and I'll sort by days on market in reverse order, right? And so I
Mhm.
can start to see which properties have been on the market, how long, and are those numbers ticking up, or are they finally
Mhm.
finding buyers? And from what I've seen, lately, the last at least the last like 4 weeks, January was a little bit different, but the trend has sort of reestablished itself that I'm seeing more price drops. I'm seeing longer days on market. So to me, that says there's no real urgency here.
Right.
You can afford to be patient. There's no penalty for being patient and sitting out.
Mhm.
But I'm also not just like totally sitting out. I'm looking at deals, watching the market, and trying to understand what the trend line is and when does it start to slow or bottom. You
That
can't
makes sense.
find it exactly, but that's my
Yeah. Well, and
strategy.
I think it has to be not just any deal, but the right deal. I think that there were a lot of deals that made sense in prior markets that don't necessarily make sense now. Not even like just the cost of rehabbing something has skyrocketed. Like the cost of rehabbing something in 2019 versus the cost of doing that same level of rehab now is probably going to be somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 times higher than it was in 2019. And that's just the fact of life is what we're dealing with, looking at different contractors and things of that nature. So finding a fix and flip type deal, you really have to understand what your numbers are going to be going into it so you don't wind up underwater without even realizing it. But the other thing that you had mentioned that I thought was really interesting was staying on top of your maintenance, making sure that your tenants are satisfied, looking for little maintenance things that can be done to improve their tenant experience, or, hey, I'd really love a ceiling fan in my bedroom or something like that. The most money that most landlords spend in a short duration is during turnovers. Turnovers tend to be the most expensive part of landlording, whether it be the actual physical turn of the apartment or the time with the apartment spending vacant or whatever the case may be. That block of time when you're without a tenant in that unit tends to be the most expensive time for you as a landlord. So whatever you can do to kind of reduce those times by keeping tenants in for longer periods of time, not having that turnover, really does help cash flow in a big way. And I think a lot of landlords forget just how much it sucks to have a vacancy, especially here in Buffalo. Like it's March, we're finally starting to get through the winter months, but having a vacancy in January in Buffalo, you're not finding a good tenant more than likely during that time frame. So it's just basically watching money disappear right in front of you. So I like that stance of making sure that maintenance is kept uh, on top of, for lack of a better term. You're staying on top of maintenance, maybe finding little things that'll improve the property or the tenant experience. Do you see that your tenants stay longer as a result of that strategy?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a, big enough sample of
Hmm.
data points across just my, somewhat small portfolio right now. But I would say over time, absolutely, it's not just about rent.
Hmm.
It's also about the overall experience you're delivering.
Hmm.
So I think it's been maybe less important, over the last few years when you could kind of push rents. Tenants didn't have a lot of options. There weren't a lot of other places to go necessarily, especially as
Hmm.
people like kind of hunkered down and made their homes a little bit nicer during COVID. Um, that's starting to change a little bit. There's a lot of multifamily supply that's come online that those owners and developers are being a bit more aggressive now with
Hmm.
incentives and trying to lure tenants away. So, that's maybe more of a multifamily issue, but I think it does start to leak into single family rentals as well. Some of those tenants figure out, hey, there's a new apartment building a couple blocks away and they've got some
Hmm.
deals going on. So,
Hmm.
the calculation is starting to change a little bit.
Hmm. Well, and it's interesting because we don't see a lot of single family, like new build single family, like build to rent type stuff here in Western New York. So there's very few people renting what I would consider newer single families here in Western New York. Most of our housing stock, honestly, most of the housing stock in the city of Buffalo is late 1900, or I'm sorry, late 1800s, early 1900s. And then as you
Wow.
start getting into like first ring suburbs, it's, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And as you kind of go out, maybe you'll see some newer stuff in maybe the second ring suburbs and things of that nature. But it's not like we're seeing a lot of single family stuff being built. It's a lot of single family assets being built strictly for the rental market. So single families, I don't want to call them an oddity in the rental market here, but it's not as common as it is in, say, Arizona, where you may have a developer
Yeah.
go in and build an entire development that's built as build to rent type situation. We do a lot more with multifamily and stuff like that out here. So it's just an interesting difference in what the stock is from one market to another, I would say. All right, we got time for one more question here. This one comes from Ed. Can I expense an $85,000 new roof on a mixed use building that has 30 residential and 10 commercial units? The revenue breakdown is 70% residential, 30% commercial.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of experience with mixed use. I
Hmm.
would imagine there's some sort of proration that happens, but definitely question for a CPA on what the sort of aggressive strategy is, what the safe
Hmm.
strategy is, and where you want to end up.
Yeah, and I know there's a couple different ways of looking. And again, I'm not an accountant by any stretch, so I don't know all the ins and outs and the rules, but I believe there's ways that you can accelerate the depreciation on certain items and things like that. I don't know how all of it works. That's definitely a question that's probably best left to a CPA, I would say. I think a CPA is probably going to be best able to answer that one. I know that you can. It's a capex. I mean, there's going to be some capacity in which you can write off some or all of that roof, but I think it's basically going to boil down to what the allowables are for that specific property. And I don't know if there's a difference between commercial and, I guess there is, because it would be the depreciation schedules are different on a commercial structure than a residential. So there would have to be something with it being mixed use, I guess. But I'll be honest with you, that would be a question that would probably be best answered by a CPA. All right. As we pull into the station here, Devin, why don't you go ahead and tell us how people can go ahead finding you?
Sure. Yeah. So you can get to me through Stessa or Roofstock. Right now, I'm running the content strategy team on the Roofstock side, but I keep closely in touch with the team at Stessa as well. So if you sign up for Stessa, you can actually there's a in the lower right corner there's a chat box there, and you can send me a note there. It'll get to me. I still kind of keep track of all the feedback and kind of take the temperature of the Stessa customer base, just to
Mhm.
understand, what investors are doing, how they're liking the product, and where we need to go in terms of new features. So that's probably the best place to track me down.
Very cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stick with me. I'm going to pull you off screen here for a second, but we got to get the rest of your video uploaded. I'll be back with you in just a moment. All right, everybody, thank you for joining us for our March AMA session. We do love doing these, and the best way for you to contribute to these is actually to ask us a question. We actually post these, generally speaking, about a week to 2 weeks before we do them live. So if you have a question, we actually post a link in the event that'll allow you to get your question in beforehand so that we can actually preload it into our software here. But even beyond that, if you are watching these live or even after the fact, you can always drop a question in the comments, and we do try to come back and answer as many of those as possible. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I'm Andrew Schultz for RentPrep.com, and we'll see you real soon.